Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sharon Bonney. I'm the CEO for the Coalition on Adult-Based Education. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar today, Considerations when Implementing Distance Learning. And this webinar is generously sponsored by Essential Education. So I'm going to turn this over to Dan Griffith with Essential Education. And I just want to note, as Dan comes on, if you want to give him a hearty welcome in the chat box. Essential Education has been a wonderful partner to us and a wonderful partner to the field of adult education. Dan?
Appreciate it. Let me share my screen here. Oh, I can't while you're sharing. Oh, there we go. Now I can. All right. Welcome, everybody. We appreciate the opportunity to sponsor this webinar. We're really excited about this one as well because we feel that distance learning is kind of a central point in the wheelhouse of essential education. We did just launch our new free distance learning series, and there are 6 courses in this series. You can sign up for it. Go to essentialed.com/educators/distance-learning-series. And each of the courses is between 20 minutes and 40 minutes, and you will get a certificate for them. We're excited because there's a progression of the content here that's kind of natural. From what kind of hardware you need to how to set up your records management. We actually worked with 2 teachers who actually are distance learning teachers to get a view of distance learning from their perspective. And of course, these center also will show you, if you're a user of our program, tips and tricks for using our program in that format as well. And if you do all 6, you get a certificate of completion for the whole 6-part series. So we invite you to come and take a look. Since we launched it on Monday, we've had over 1,600 people sign up for various courses. So we're really excited about that as well. And then just in keeping with the theme of this webinar, we wanted to address just a couple of things that we think are important when you're considering distance learning. The first is the built-in practice tests. Our program has 4 practice tests for each content area of each of the HSC assessments. They're high-quality assessments aligned to the specific test that provide great feedback and information for you as the distance learning teacher to know exactly where to target student work. We also have great study time tracking, so it's easy to read reports. They're easy to integrate into other systems that you might have for showing distance learning time. And then for those of you that are maybe in larger districts or working with specific learning management systems, we do have API capabilities as well that would let you create things like single sign-ons for students so that they can come into maybe your learning management system and automatically be signed into our program. We can even do different versions of data sharing that allow us to pass information back and forth so that all that time recording and performance recording happens automatically without you having to do that manually. So if you'd like any information about how our system can really benefit you in distance learning, you can reach me at dan@essentialed.com, and I'll be glad to get you to our correct rep. Or just go to essentialed.com/educators, and all of our information is up there and you can check out the system. Thank you, Sharon, appreciate it. And I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you, Dan. And I just think that's so exciting what you all are offering, and I feel like it's such a benefit to the field. So we're super grateful for your partnership and for all Essential Education has done. I want to take a minute here to mention that this webinar is being recorded. It's going to be archived in the Adult Educator Repository, which Essential Education also sponsored. It's a wonderful place where you can go and find all of the webinars, all of the resources, all of the PowerPoints, tons and tons of information that's available to you there free of charge as members. So everybody on this webinar is going to receive a certificate of attendance that will come to you within 24 hours. Also, this information that we're sharing here will also be in that Adult Educator Repository. So the PowerPoint, all of that, because we always get that same question from members. Also, just wanted to mention, today's the last day for Advocacy April. This is a great time to make your voice heard for funding for adult education. We have 2 asks out there right now, specifically around the COVID-19 crisis that we've all been dealing with. If you and your adult learners have been feeling the effects of this, We are working on getting you funding, but we all need to come together for that. So I encourage you to go to www.coeb.org. There's a bunch of details there that are very easy to understand about how to take action for funding for adult education. As well, we have a series of professional development webinars specifically targeted to training to help you navigate the challenges that you've been dealing with COVID-19. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for those. And finally, I'd like to introduce you to today's webinar presenter, Jay Wright. Jay, I'd love to share your bio here with our folks, so I'm going to take a moment to do that. Jay Wright manages training and technical assistance for federal and California accountability requirements, including WIOA Title II federal reporting requirements and the California Adult Education Program, CAPE. He provides a variety of face-to-face and online trainings to guide assessment implementation and software management, and updates to fields on new statewide and federal reporting requirements. So I know that the reason why that this was so well attended with so many people registering is because this really is something that the field needs. So Jay, I'm turning this over to you.
Okay, hello everybody. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay, and I'm going to go ahead and get into screen sharing mode with the PowerPoint. So we should be okay now. So hopefully you see the screen fine and you all hear me fine. Maybe a couple chats just for sanity would be helpful. Okay, it looks like
we do see your slides, and we do want to encourage everybody, just please do not put chat in the Q&A, chat in the chat box and put questions in the Q&A, and we will circle back at the end of this presentation if there's time for the questions. Okay, thank you.
And great, and I'll add, we've got a huge crowd, so we do need to finish at 3 Eastern, but this is being recorded, so they are going to be giving me all the questions. I'll definitely try to answer them all as quickly as possible, so there may be some that we may get back at tomorrow, you know, on Google Docs or something like that. I'll move into the agenda so we can kind of get going here. To be clear, this is a presentation I've done a few times for California. As Sharon said, I work for CASAS. We're contracted with the State Department of Ed in California for all things WIOA 2 in that state. We have another leadership project named OTAN that also, you know, works for a CDE contract. We've done a bunch of these collaboratively, you know, here since mid-March, you know, when everything, you know, started changing a little bit. So we've done this a lot. Everybody's been taking a crash course in distance learning. So this is a synopsis of one that we've done a couple times for California. That said, there's probably a few California-centric things in here. I really tried to scrub and purge some of the more California-specific issues, some of the more CASA-specific issues, but I'm sure there's probably a couple things that still look a little too California-ish. So just a caveat before getting in too far. So we'll talk a little bit. Obviously, COVID-19 has affected adult education and everybody else. So a few obvious things to get started, such as Octane Memo 20-3 and 20-4. So I'm not from Octane, so I'm not the one to cover it, but I do want to cover a couple points that it brought up, and it's been a big impetus for a lot of the things that we've done over the last month or so. And then there's 3 big issues that keep coming up, kind of loosely creating 3 categories here, but I really think that most of the crash course and distance learning issues have fallen into one of these buckets. One is how to create classes. This my presentation probably looks at it from a TOPSPro Enterprise or TE perspective. That's our data management system at CASAS. But I think the basic issues with the strategies are the same, no matter what data management system you're using. That is, you know, do we start fresh or do we pick up where we left off? So we'll talk about some basic strategies for how to deal with classes now that we have to restructure everything the last couple months. Another one is how to deal with hours. You know, everybody's taken that crash course in distance learning. Lots of obvious issues on how we measure hours. Sometimes the distance learning is synchronous or facilitated. Teacher and students are all in the same place at the same time, but a lot of times distance learning means the student is working on her own or his own. That creates a lot of questions related to how do we deal with the hours, knowing that we're not directly watching the student doing everything. So some tips on how to deal with hours. And then the one that's hit home for me working at CASAS is dealing with pre and post testing and other assessments. I was joking with Shannon, I'm kind of multitasking today. There's some big trainings in California that we're doing with CDE, where we're unveiling our remote testing process today, another couple big days next week. But we've been working feverishly on how to deal with pre and post testing remotely. We also have a program in California called EL Civics. We've been working on doing those assessments remotely. I won't get too into that, but I will bring it up as one way we're looking at as an alternative, knowing that some agencies can get going on remote testing. Others are going to have a very, very, very difficult time. So we are presenting our EL Civics additional assessments as maybe one way agencies can get around that. There are issues there too, but the bar for doing those additional assessments probably not quite as high as it is for doing pre and post testing. Okay, so moving on to the general COVID-19 issues. COABE has had a website, I'm pretty sure since pretty much square one of COVID-19, lots of great stuff on their site. In California, OTAN put a website, it was Friday the 13th. From a California perspective, that was kind of the day everything changed. So OTAN was directed to put up this special site. It's kind of been the hub of the California COVID-19 adult ed universe ever since. So there's a lot of good resources on the OTAN page as well. Okay, one more general all-purpose, obviously at the federal level, two really, really big memos. 20-3 came out on March 27th. Follow-up memo 20-4 on April 17th. I'm sure a lot of you have seen these. Here's the links. So for all the details, obviously better just to direct you to these links and read the memos yourself. Long story short though, from my opinion, is the memos basically undid some of the long-standing federal level guidelines we've had on testing. That is, testing's always required a face-to-face proctor for a variety of standardization and test security issues. We've always said, well, we can't really do it because the feds require these standardization and test security measures. Long story short, 20-3 loosened that up a little bit and made it up to the states to decide whether or not it wanted to require that or not. It also required all states to identify students who are impacted. That's the force majeure I'm sure a lot of you have been talking about and grappling with. So it basically required us all to report in numbers, all the students who were affected by this, who weren't able to be tested, who were perhaps kicked out of class because of school closures and so on. Okay, sticking with some basic NRS, this obviously is nothing new. This is what's existed all along in NRS, but obviously a lot of us have been dusting off a lot of these policies related to distance education here the last couple months. This slide just gives you the generic NRS definition of distance learning, page 59 if you want to look it up. But it's real simple. It's basically formal learning activity where students and instructors are separated by geography, time, or both for the majority of the instructional period. Some of the in the margins issue here, again, it gives you a big long laundry list of all the different ways in which you could theoretically call it distance education. Lots of different types of technology you can use as well. But I kind of think the generic definition is the easiest. That is, if you're separated by time, geography, or both, then by definition, you're in some kind of distance education. You're doing something outside the quote unquote regular classroom. Okay, we've been presenting these in kind of an FAQ format. So here's the first slide that looks at it that way. So what are the special requirements? The long-standing policy for all distance learning students has been the same as all other WIOA Title II learners. You document their enrollment and do so on day one of their enrollment. You pre and post test them just like all other learners. You record hours for them just like all other learners and so on. The requirements have always been the same. There has always been an issue, and again, I think this is pretty universally the same in all systems, but you mark special programs distance learning. Some systems might have a slightly different title for the field or the specific checkbox, but there's always been a way where we've been required to specify which learners are our distance learning students. So we put them special programs as distance learning to show that their instruction was received outside the regular classroom. And then again, there's a new requirement now with that 20-3, again, the force majeure again, adding a new feature to track students with program year 1920 activities that were affected by COVID-19. Not sure if that will be something we do every year now to look at the distance learning, but for this year, we'll have that special checkbox for these learners in addition to the regular stuff. Okay, what if they're in blended learning? I'm not sure if this is all states, but in California, the overwhelming majority of students in distance learning historically have always really been blended learning. That is, they're doing some of the instruction in distance learning formats, but they're doing some of it in the regular classroom as well. So for about 10 or 12 years, we've had what's called the 50% rule, which is simply if more than 50% of the student's instruction overall is in a distance learning format, mark distance learning. If it's less than 50%, then don't mark it. Pretty simple policy, you know, that is just follow the 50% rule. So again, if it's more than 50%, then we do mark distance learning in special programs. We're just providing that one checkbox to show officially that learner is a distance learning student. We know that because more than 50% of the time was outside the regular classroom. There is no requirement to specify what the exact ratio is. You know, if they're 60% distance learning and 40% regular classroom, you can specify that if you want. Some states require that level of granularity, but I'll just say for federal reporting, the exact percentage is not required as long as you follow that 50% rule. You're basically in compliance. But again, if they are more than 50%, you do need to note that for each student. What if it's less than 50%? That is, they're doing some instruction outside the regular classroom, but that equals less than 50%. Then you simply don't need to mark it. You only need to mark it if it's over 50%. Again, some systems allow you to specify that. I'll say a small but proud contingent of distance learning advocates in my state really want to be able to do this. We do have features in our system, TOPS Enterprise, that does allow you, but I'll just reiterate, you only are required to mark those that are more than 50% distance learning based on those NRS guidelines. Okay, so for distance learning, we prescribe that rule. Again, more than 50% mark it, less than 50% don't. Calculating this at the class, so for right here and now, calculating this at the class level will really depend on how you've structured classes in response to COVID-19. That's the segue to one of the three big issues that's come up again and again and again, is the school has closed, the college is closed. Obviously, everything's changed now that COVID-19 has hit, but what do we do in terms of recording how we've responded to this? Again, that's been a really, really big issue. So we've boiled it down into two basic solutions to be exceedingly clear, definitely not scientific terms, definitely not anything official. These are terms we completely made up, just as two broad ways to characterize how we would suggest you respond to class structure given everything that's happened with COVID-19. Again, one way is pick up where you left off. The second way is start completely new classes specific to distance learning. So the first one, again, is pick up where you left off, which is just what the title suggests. This says, yes, COVID-19 is a big deal. It closed down our college, it closed down the school, but we're continuing classes as they were scheduled originally. We're picking up where we left off. So everything, this suggests everything's basically the same. Teacher is the same. Students are the same. You're still meeting Tuesday and Thursday at 10 a.m. every week. But the only difference is now we're meeting with the same teacher and same group of students on Zoom instead of meeting in the regular classroom. Then we basically just keep the same class, same title, same ID, and so on. We don't really need to change anything, but we do, however, need to calculate whether the instruction overall is more than 50% or less than 50% distance learning for that federal guideline. So here's a quick example to exemplify pick up where you left off. So we have an ESL class. It began on August 1. It was scheduled to run through the end of May. The dates, I think, are pretty, similar to what a lot of us have done. We did it in a regular classroom. We ran it through March 13th. We had a little bit of a week where we were restructuring because the school or college was closed. So we had a week off, but we immediately got it going via distance learning on March 23rd. So in this example, we don't mark distance learning as less than 50% of the instruction was delivered outside the regular classroom. We had a lot of instruction already since August. We just had a month or so at the end that was via distance learning. So again, keep the same class record, same title, same ID, same everything. You don't really need to mark anything in this example because it was less than 50% distance learning. Second example, ABE class that began March 1st, and again, same as the other one, scheduled to run through the end of May. Same shutdown time. We suspended activity on March 13th. We resumed activity on March 23rd. In this example, we would mark distance learning. In this case, we barely got started before we had to switch the class. So in this case, the overwhelming majority was outside the regular classroom. So for this class and these students, we would mark distance learning because it was clearly more than 50%. Okay, second method is we start new classes specific to distance learning. So we're saying start new classes. So this suggests that, hey, the changes related to COVID-19 were a little bit more severe. We shut down the classes we were already doing. The teacher might be different. The group of students is different. So we're starting completely new classes and just marking them as distance learning. We're not seeing enough similarity what was going on before. So we've got a new teacher, new group of students. So in this case, we create brand new classes, give it a new start date of late March, early April, or whenever you were able to get started with distance learning. In our system, we have a couple other labels you can give it by class if you want. A lot of systems have that, so you might want to label some of these, a different way so you can then track which classes are those specific ones that you started in late March, early April in response to all this. But again, by policy, you don't necessarily need to. For the new created classes, you mark distance learning because, of course, in that case, 100% of it is distance learning. For the ones you already did, obviously, you do not mark distance learning because theoretically for those 0% was distance learning. So, you leave those alone. For the classes, again, that existed prior, you don't need to mark anything. Okay, so a quick example for this. Again, the same ESL class started on August 1, scheduled to run through the end of May, ended due to COVID-19. The last day of regular class, like the previous examples, March 13th. We started a brand new class via distance learning on March 23rd. So again, we have that one class we created at the beginning of the year, give it an end date of March 13th, close the books on that class, start a new class that you've marked for distance learning, start date of March 23rd in this specific example. Another example, again, similar as the other example, starting March 1st, scheduled to run through the end of May. It too ended on March 13th for all the obvious reasons. We started a completely new class again on March 23rd for this one. So again, the way we mark the DL is exactly the same. We just have a different window for the two classes. The first one, obviously very abbreviated. The second one will start March 23rd and be exclusively through distance learning. Okay, I'll make a little bit of a plug for my system. Again, not many of you here. I'll just say this, I think kind of applies to all systems, is that in some agencies, some states, you're really interested in getting to a deeper level of granularity. Again, for NRS, we're just concerned about 50%, but in a lot of agencies and states, we're really trying to track with that higher level of detail. So I'll just say, here's a screenshot from our system where if you want to do this, you can mark the overall hours and you can specify exactly which hours are distance learning. So if you feel like you've got a lot of distance learning that's happening, you really want to show that you're doing all those wonderful things via distance learning, but it just so happens a lot of it is below 50%, you can still record that a lot of this activity is happening by specifying overall hours and specific, DL hours. I'll just say if you do use our system or you just want some information on how that might work in theory, there's a link to a detailed help document that allows you to track it with an even greater level of detail if you're interested in doing so. Okay, we're at a little bit of a transition, so I'm going to look at a couple questions here real quickly. So I'll say CASAS testing. It's not available online as we speak, but as I said at the beginning, we've been doing lots and lots and lots of pilot testing. We did a nationwide webinar last week detailing how the piloting is going. We have a specific California training today and Monday on the same topic. I think I would just encourage you to email casas@casas.org. That's a generic one. That's the easy answer. We have gotten started. If you go to our CASAS homepage, there's a couple PowerPoints that detail the field testing we've been doing. We've been starting with a small group with phase 1. That ends on tomorrow, actually. We'll be starting phase 2 on Monday. We'll be opening it up to more formats technologically, opening it up to more agencies. But there's a really detailed hour-long PowerPoint that talks about these test security issues. Again, that's an hour we don't have now, but I'd encourage you to download that for Gita. If you're doing TE, you can give access Michelle. If you want to look at just generally how we do it, you can access that document from the link. Okay, next question. I'm not sure about what that is. It depends on your system. For TE, we have that program. There's a checkbox that we already have in TE. It varies from state to state. In California, we're still working on our state policy. So at least in California, I've been telling everybody to hang tight because in our state, we're still working on a definitive policy for this. I know all states are a little bit different. I would encourage you, Ann, to contact your state on whether your state is still working on it like California or whether they already have a specific policy that tells you when you should be marking it. For DL test proctoring, my guess is, they might be waiting on us or the competitors. I'll just say from our point of view, for CASA states, we had a big webinar last week. Again, we're still working on a few more things before we'll be ready to release it to the entire field, but we have informed the field on what we're doing. My understanding is pretty much everybody's been doing the same thing as us. You may need to change the designation at the end of the year. Yes. I mean, again, with some of those examples, we're figuring for you to project. So for the examples I gave, I'll say we went out of our way to give examples that are really clear cut, where there's one example where it's overwhelmingly more than 50% and another where it's overwhelmingly less. So for those examples, you should be able to project ahead of time and probably get a good idea pretty easily, but admittedly, you're going to have some close calls where, yeah, Deborah, you might need to go back at the end of the year and specify that. In TE, Megan, you can mark it either the student or the class level. Again, different systems have different protocols for that. I'll just say in our system, you can do either. Not really, Michael. You can do it either way. I'm trying to be clean with my examples. So yeah, I'm suggesting pick up where you left off would be for when you're really keeping it more or less the same in terms of teacher assignment or student composition. But if you really want to keep your classes the same from a database management point of view, even though things are changing more than that, by all means, you can do that, yes. I'll just say to your second question, we've been working on that a lot, especially with the EL Civic side. So the short answer is yes. I think different states have different policies on that one, but at least in my state, Michael, we've been encouraging people to do exactly that. Yes, Alejandra, all your examples are distance learning. Yes, Valerie, all of your examples are too. Not quite sure. I think the answer to your question is yes, Michael, but it looks like that might be for your state. Number 2, I'm not sure what you mean by that one. Sorry, I'm reading off. I'm assigning by name. So Megan, I'll just say your question. You can mark student or class level to either one of those, yes. Okay, sorry I brushed through the questions quickly, but I want to make sure I finish. Again, all of your questions probably got short shrift, but I'll go back and answer all of them here over the next 24 hours. So to get a better answer, stay tuned tomorrow morning. I'll have better answers then where I'm not too pressed for time. I'm going to transfer to the second big issue. Again, we're defining this as 3 kind of holy grails that have come up right away for distance learning. The first one is how to deal with class creation. The second one is how to deal with instructional hours. So here's another thing from the NRS regs that have been there for many moons, but probably have been ignored by most people and dusted off substantially over the last 6 or 8 weeks. Again, the 3 NRS models for measuring distance learning: simply clock time, teacher verification, and learner mastery. Short, brief explanation is clock time is just going by a clock. That is when you're in the regular classroom. If everybody's there for an hour, you give them an hour of instruction. Clock time suggests for distance learning, you're doing it exactly the same way. So if you're doing an hour of instruction in the regular classroom and you're giving the student an hour, that suggests that if they're doing an hour via Zoom, you're also giving them exactly 1 hour of instruction. So again, clock time, pretty obvious. You're just marking it according to the amount of clock time the student has spent engaged in that particular mode of instruction. For distance learning, though, of course, we have some asynchronous or self-paced learning activities. We do a lot. So we have 2 other models: one, teacher verification; the other, learner mastery. Teacher verification puts it a lot on the teacher, where the teacher is observing each student, putting a lot of dedicated time and watching what each student is doing. So the teacher can accurately give a specific amount of hours for each student that completes the activity. The second one, learner mastery, is also for those asynchronous sort of activities, but that basically suggests that you're working as a team and looking at the activities first, assigning hours to that activity, and then assigning that number that your team at your agency assigned to each student equally. Again, you can do either. In general, NRS is looking for everyone at the state level to use all 3 of these, but kind of indicate at the state level which one you use the most or which one you follow as your state, assessment policy and state plan. In our state, I'll just add, we tend to err on the side of learner mastery. We don't require everybody to use learner mastery, but we do state that in our California assessment policy that learner mastery is our preferred way. We've always preferred learner mastery because we feel that's the way we apply the same number of hours to each student equally. I'll just say what we think is not necessarily what everybody thinks, but I will add that the NRS and Octave do generally like each state to kind of say how you're doing it independently in your state. That's how we do it. I'll double back to say you can do any of these, and I'll explain these equally as well. So again, distance learning. So here's a summary. This is a little bit California centric. If your state disagrees, fine, but I think we're mostly like everybody else here. So again, if it's facilitated online instruction, that is the teacher is working on Zoom or on the internet and everybody's logged in and you're all one big happy family, that's where we would use the clock time model. That is, if it's synchronous or facilitated, we're saying that's the same thing as regular instruction. An hour online is the same thing as an hour in the regular classroom. A lot of you are using educational software even before COVID-19. Obviously, educational software applications have been a big shift in adult ed anyway. So for those, the recommendation is to pre-assign a number of hours to each lesson or module. Ideally, pre-assign it based on what the software publisher tells you. If not, come up with something at your own agency level, or in some cases, the state level, to come up with a preset number of hours. What we've been doing now that everybody's doing a crash course in distance learning is we've come up with 3 general approaches that we think are useful for determining proxy hours for software. I'll birdwalk a minute. I use proxy in quotes. Probably a lot of us have seen a lot of things where we've used, you might say, antiquated terms or things that made sense a long time ago. We realize now that we're using this term too much. Proxy, I admit, very confusing term. I keep using it unwittingly, but we're just talking about hours that we preset as a management team. We define what each unit or module is worth in terms of hours and put it in writing so we then can apply it all equally. Sorry, that proxy has been a very confusing term to a lot of people, so I put it in quotes there. So digging into hours a little bit more, how do we record hours for online facilitated instruction? Again, this is the simple answer. Use the clock time model. So if we're meeting Tuesday at 10 a.m. in the regular classroom, now we're meeting Tuesday at 10 a.m. via Zoom. The approach to hours is exactly the same. Give an hour via Zoom, just like you would give an hour, in the regular classroom. And then just to note, based on the other issue we brought up, you might also need to look at the 50% rule as well. Okay, what if you're having them do a recording? That's a big one that's come up that, quite frankly, we didn't have any policy for before March of 2020. But a lot of you have come up with, yeah, we're doing a lot of instruction via Zoom. The students are attending. Overall, it's working well, but we always end up with a few students that are unable to attend class. So we record Zoom just like we're doing here with COAVE and me. We record it and we direct students to go back and watch the recording. So what we're saying to that, first off, is it is up to you to decide whether you want to allow that as hours of instruction. A lot of agencies in California anyway are vociferously saying we're not allowing recordings because it's such a slippery slope in terms of figuring out whether it really was that student or not. So I'll go out of my way to say it's really your choice at the agency level, or at least our state policy is we allow agencies to decide that. So if you don't like doing it that way, that's fine. Don't allow it. Just put it in your policy that you're not allowing it. If you do allow it, then we would just say, yeah, equate it with the time assigned to the live presentation. So, and we're usually saying, yeah, create some kind of assignment for those students. So then you can employ that learner mastery, give it an hour, have that student complete some kind of activity to show that she or he really knows that material, and then give them the instruction after they demonstrate that learner mastery. Whatever you decide, again, you have the flexibility to make your own decision. We've been saying detail that in your local assessment policy. I'll birdwalk once again and say, I think that term, local assessment policy, is a universal term, but if it isn't, I'll just say that's the term we use to define the policy that all WIOA Title II agencies must develop locally in response to the statewide policy in terms of how you're doing testing. In our state policy, we have a section, and this has been true for 20 years. We've always had a section dedicated exclusively to distance learning. And so what we say is if you do distance learning, you add that in your local assessment policy. How you're doing hours would be an example of something you would put there in the local policy. So first, how do we, so now we're getting more into the non-facilitated or asynchronous. How do we record hours of instruction when students complete lessons using educational software? I'll just say you're free to do it how you want, but we typically suggest learner mastery. That is, we want to look at each unit in each module, assign an amount of hours to each unit or module, put it in writing in our local assessment policy, and basically follow that for each student. I'll just say different agencies and states have different viewpoints here, but our state policy has always emphasized learner mastery with the idea that if you give the student, whether it's a website, video, educational software, whatever activity you're getting any student to do on his or her own, Students are going to complete it with different methods. Some students will just jump in and do that hour in an hour. They'll devour it. They'll get it done right away. Other students will be interrupted 10 or 20 times and take 4 or 5 hours to get it done. So for those sort of perfunctory reasons, we've always decided it best to use learner mastery in both of those situations. You know, in those two scenarios, one student takes an hour, the other takes 5 hours, but they basically completed the same amount of instruction. So we would suggest learner mastery to make sure we're applying everything consistently to all students. Okay, so we've dug a little deeper in this. This is something that's definitely not in our state policy, but here the last couple months, we've gotten lots of questions. So we've been working out this in even greater detail. So we've come up with 3 different approaches to, again, that quote unquote proxy hours model. So the first one is kind of the low hanging fruit. That is, we're using educational software, sometimes video or websites, but usually it's the educational software that will program hours into each lesson or module. Obviously, that's the best case scenario if they program it for you. Obviously, we'd say take what the publisher gives you, save yourself a lot of work, and use the hours they already populated into their software. A second, slightly higher hanging fruit approach, but still the same idea, is that some of those educational software applications don't program it into the software, but they will kind of go out of their way to recommend a certain number of hours for each unit or module. The obvious recommendation there is use some kind of learner mastery approach, simply following what the software publisher tells you to do. Way easier to just use their hours than have to do it yourself. The third one you might say is the high-hanging fruit approach, where sometimes they just don't provide that sort of information for you. So that's when we say you should meet as an instructional management team, determine the amount of time a quote-unquote average student takes, and then document your process for your agency in your own local assessment policy. Okay, so here's a few examples. Again, trying to give as many examples as possible. So here's the first one, kind of the low-hanging fruit example, where the software records the correct number of hours in its system. If the student's on the software for 45 minutes, it will record that the student was there for 45 minutes. So in this example, they complete module 1. Module 1 records 1 hour. So you can just note in that educational software that they logged in an hour. You can then record that. Okay, here's a California-centric error on my end. Record it in whatever your data system is. Use exactly what that educational software project recorded for you. Okay, second example. Again, similar, but not exactly the same. They don't program it for you, but they do provide a recommended hours for each lesson or module. You know, then you don't have anything recorded in that educational software, but just look at their manual, record hours according to what they suggest for you, you know, and then go module by module, record that for the student, what she or he completes each individual module. Example 3, here's the longer one. The software doesn't provide any times for completion. It doesn't provide any of that extra programming. So here's what we're saying. Meet as a management team locally, review the material you're using for distance learning, figure out what an average student takes, agree as a team that here's the right amount for that unit or module, document that thoroughly in your agency's local assessment policy. So to continue on that example, we're observing students who complete the module informally. You know, we're not saying it has to be a set amount, ideally more than one person, however, but agree on what that average amount of time is for a typical student. So in this example, the average student takes 2 hours to complete a particular module. We know that's an average amount. Some might take a little longer, some might be a little quicker, but the average is 2 hours in this example. So we're going to agree that module number 1 is 2 hours. Anytime a student completes module 1, we'll record 2 hours for that student. That way we can record that amount of time equally for all students who complete that specific module. And then in bold, here's that parroted phrase again. Be sure to document in your agency specific policy, your specific policy approach and your agency local assessment policy. Once again, I'll admit that I'm not sure that term is the same for all states, but that's what we call it in California. You should have a local policy that you already have that deals with things like how you do assessment and test security. Here's how we document hours as it applies to, NRS and WIO too. So in that policy you already have, add this information related to distance learning. So here's just exploring the example a little bit more. Here's, taking it to the nth degree where we've got a 12 module software program. You can simply list all 12 modules. Sometimes all modules are the same. We intentionally kind of made a complex example here where each module was a little bit different. We had to go module by module. It was a little bit more work than usual, but we did get through it, and we did dutifully assign a different hours total to each module, knowing that your mileage might vary in this particular example. So again, spell it out, put it in writing in your policy, list the number of hours assigned to each module, and then record the hours in your data system based on the modules they complete and the number of hours you've dutifully assigned to each module. A few general guidelines, and then I'll get to a few of the questions. The first one, most obviously, is contact your software publisher. If you're using a video, contact your video provider or the website manager. Whatever you're using, you can contact that. Again, software is the most popular, so that's what we write. So even if they haven't provided you any guidance related to hours, there's a really good chance they can probably still help you. So we're obviously recommending contacting them regardless, even if they didn't provide anything. A lot of times they can help, and given everything, our experience is they've been exceedingly helpful in trying to help agencies out with this kind of information, you might say, for all the obvious reasons. The recommendation should be an average. We know that nobody has the ability to get some giant committee. So I know my slide probably sounds a little heavy-handed. Understood, there's no way you're going to get a giant committee, but we are saying make it more than one person, just so you can make sure, kind of sanity check-wise, that what you're putting in your agency policy is an agreed upon number and not just the feeling of one individual. Another key thing is trial and error is allowed. Again, back to the title, we're talking about how everybody's taking a crash course in distance learning. Understood that most of us are doing this for the very first time, so nobody's going to get it right 100% of the time. So if you meet as a team, given everything the way it is now, really good chance you might meet haphazardly because you're really trying to get something out the door. So your teachers and students have something to go by here. And doing that, you're not going to get it exactly right. So if you quickly say, yeah, we're going to give an hour to all these modules right now, and then we're going to give ourselves more time to really roll up our sleeves and investigate. By September, we've looked at all the results. We know it's really more like an hour and a half, not an hour. Totally fine for you to modify the policy after you've got all the information in and make changes as you go. That cliche about designing the airplane while you're in the air, you might say a lot of this stuff is the perfect match for that cliche. To assign hours by student, so here's the flip side. If you decide you would rather do teacher verification than learner mastery, you don't really feel like you can do this, you want to leave it to the teacher, 100% A-OK, but the warning there is that does put a lot on the teacher. That does suggest that the teacher is monitoring students when they're doing this, that the teacher really is looking carefully and looking student by student, so the teacher for each student can give a different number for each student. I'll just say, from our point of view, we always recommended learning mastery because we know that puts way too much on the teacher, really difficult for teachers to commit that much time to micromanaging everybody. But again, if you want to do that, fine. And then assigning hours on an individual student basis is permissible. Again, just describe how you're observing students, what process you're using for making sure it's that student. for being able to determine what each student is doing individually and so on. Okay, so here's statewide and local assessment policy. I'll just add, I've brought this up probably 5 or 6 times here now. Everything says document the process in your agency's local assessment policy. We've said that 20 times already. You know, so just a little bit on what we mean by that. To back up a step, again, just to be sure everybody's clear, the local assessment policy requirement is part of that statewide assessment policy. So all states every year submit a statewide assessment policy to the NRS or OCTAE for federal approval. So we're like all states there. In our state, a big contingent of the statewide assessment policy is that it requires all local WIOA 2 agencies to develop its own local assessment policy. So again, the statewide policy requires that. It basically has the statewide policy for pre and post testing, 40 or 70 hours between testing, what we do for placement, POPs, assessment training, you know, all those sorts of things are included in our statewide assessment policy. One of the big things within that requires the guidelines for local assessment. I won't get into this too much because we don't really have time, but again, it's where you specify all of these issues related to testing. And then we also have special things we need to add, such as accommodating learners with disabilities and defining procedures for distance learning. That's what we mean. Just wanted to birdwatch. Some of you know exactly what I mean, but I know some of you don't. I'll just add in California, this is way California centric, but in our state, we have what's called Appendix C. I'm pretty sure that's unique to us, but what's not unique to us is that we meet the requirements everybody has to have something in our statewide policy that addresses distance learning. Again, in our state, that's Appendix C, where we define what distance learning is. We talk about testing, we talk about permissible curricula, and then we get into a lot of this stuff I just explained related to instructional hours. Again, another thing that's probably collected dust at a lot of agencies in a lot of states over the years, but has definitely been dusted off substantially here over the last 6 or 8 weeks. So again, here's just more information on what our appendix includes. Lots of detailed information about distance learning. This is what we've really been focused on a lot here lately. Okay, so let me get into a few questions here. So Nancy, 50%. Yes, it's for the entire. Yes.
Jay, this is Sharon. Thank you so much. You're doing a fantastic job. Could you just read the question out so people know what you're referring to? We're getting a lot of responses in the chat that people they're not sure what you're referring to.
So Nancy's question is the 50% is calculated for the entire semester or class? Yes, it is. Okay, Megan, are we marking the student or class as distance learning? In our system, TE, you can do either one. You have the ability to do both. It's either or. I'll add, though, that your mileage may vary. Different systems, you know, require it different ways. So it really depends on which specific data system you're using. Okay, Michael, for pickup, is it necessary that live online classes specifically take place? I think I answered this one. The answer there is it presumes that usually, but if you figured out that you're making a lot of changes, but nonetheless pick up where you left off works for you well, my answer would be go ahead, knock yourself out. Those are literally things we've made up in the last 2 months just so we provide some guidance instead of no guidance at all. Alejandra, yes, Zoom, you know, that's distance learning. The answer to your question, Alejandra, is yes. The answer to your question, Valerie Harris, is also yes. I think you've got the same questions there. I'm not quite sure what you mean, Michael, on that one. I'm going to leave that one for later, I guess. So I'll just say, Cecilia, that's a good, you know, how do you avoid cheating? That's why I think the OCTAE is leaving it up to states. We've been working with a lot of different states. Some states just want to get remote testing and remote learning off the ground. They're more interested in moving forward. Some are more concerned with issues like you. So that's an agency and state level issue on how far you want to go with this. but I'll just go back to that statewide and local assessment policy. Those are the sort of things you should be indicating on what steps are you taking to identify the student. Sometimes different types of technology may be allowed and disallowed and so on. So these are all in the Q&A. Philip, I'm going to move out of this and just say I've got 35 to go. I'll never make it. So I'm going to finish the presentation and just get out of Q&A. I'm realizing I'm setting a death sentence for me and everybody else if I try to go down this. So sorry about that, but I'm going to just finish the presentation. I'll look at questions and provide answers tomorrow. So this is getting more into learner mastery. Again, observe this. I'm going to, here's a local assessment policy example. Here's an appendix that we've developed for COVID-19. I think this is true for everybody. Everybody needs to add, what you're doing to respond to COVID-19. Here's our California example on what we started to do. I'm pretty sure based on force majeure and all that sort of stuff, you don't need to have it look like this, but you need to come up with something like this to show how we're responding to COVID-19. So a little bit on testing. There were a lot of questions related to how we're doing with pilot testing. Again, I'll just say we at CASAS have been doing lots of nationwide webinars on how we're responding. Short answer is we're piloting. Will be done soon. But again, the Octane memos get at a lot of these issues related to remote testing. I'll just refer you to that as one way to find out. Is again, the memos are still requiring technically testing for everybody. It is giving flexibility to each state on how it wants to handle remote testing. And it is going out of its way to tell everybody to identify those that you're unable to test due to COVID-19. So again, it's leaving it as a state decision on how far you want to get into this. So for assessment, we've broken it down into pre-post placement and EL civics. For pre and post, we're working on guidelines now. That's another ultimate designing the airplane while we're in the air sort of thing. But we have come up with a presentation. We've done it 3 or 4 times now. We're just about ready to have it be ready for prime time. Not quite yet, but here in a week or so we will. We're still doing a couple more webinars, but we are coming up with specific guidelines on how you can proctor this remotely. We are starting cautious where we're sticking with one-on-one and so on. We'll be expanding to multiple students here within the next week or 2. But again, Octane seems to be giving a lot of flexibility. Some want to jump into this and just get going quickly. Others want more test security before they get started. We're kind of working with the coalition of the willing right now. Again, some states eager, others not. I'll also mention real briefly, in California, we have a program called EL Civics that we've had going for quite a long time. We have what are called additional assessments that we've been using with our EL Civics since 2001. They're more informal, so we've really gotten into that a lot here the last couple months because we really see this as a good something is better than nothing. We know the bar for doing remote pre and post testing is very high. We've been emphasizing EL Civics as something that you can do remotely. Yes, security matters for this, but it's maybe not quite as strict as pre and post testing. So it's a way to report something instead of nothing in some cases. And I'll just add those Octane memos definitely seem to be imploring states to come up with new and innovative ways to still show your students are learning, even though we know it's going to be impossible to get everybody pre and post tested this year. So here's just a little bit on our remote testing. I won't go over all of this. This is on our CASAS website, but here's our timeline for pre and post testing. Here's just a screenshot on some of the things we've been working on. Again, we've been doing it via Zoom where we have eye contact with the student. We can see what the student is doing, all this sort of stuff. Again, this is all on our website. For placement testing, our policy is the same as pre-post, but we've been saying for placement testing, we've always said use writing samples, oral interviews, and so on. So we're still saying that, obviously, with more emphasis now. Here's some information on our website. The OTAN website for COVID-19 obviously also has lots of really good information on ways you can place students. Finally, we've been talking about EL Civics. Won't get into this in any crazy level of detail, but again, we've had these assessments for a long time. They've been informal ways to check whether students have retained the material in EL Civics. We've been looking at adapting these EL Civics co-aps as well. There's another CASAS assessment called Citizenship Interview that we also use for this. It's an oral interview assessment, so this is another one that we've seen as quote unquote low-hanging fruit that we've also been working on a lot. So I'll just say that too is on our website. If you're looking for something informal, maybe, you know, I'll just say in our state, we've had lots of agencies knowing that state and federal outcomes aren't going to do much now, but they're still nonetheless very, very eager to jump into all this because at the student level, they really want to be able to show how the student is making progress nonetheless. So we've been working on this quite a bit. Here's our co-app and sit field test. I'll just say that's the same thing, you know, a lot very similar just to show you. So here's my summary. It's 12:01 Pacific, 3:01 Eastern. So last slide here. Again, COVID-19 has had a big effect. Talked about strategies for creating distance learning classes, assigning hours to distance learners, use the statewide and local assessment policy. That's been a really big issue. Issues with implementing pre and post testing, placement testing, and EL Civics assessments. That's all I have. I'll just add, I don't have time here, but there's a bunch of more specific examples that I included in the PowerPoint. I knew up front there's no way on earth I'd have time to present it, but if you're looking for some specific examples of how to do this, lots of information in the PowerPoint that I didn't have time to present. In particular, and I'll just say in our state, this is where all the questions are coming, in particular, specific examples of how to document a lot of these different distance learning related scenarios in your local policy. Again, you're not required to do it in this format at all, but most of you are saying, give us some kind of example so we know what the heck to do. So hopefully somehow, some way that will be helpful. I'll squelch myself. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Jay, for all of this. And I just want to remind everybody that the PowerPoint will be available tomorrow in our adult educator repository. We'll also send out an email that has this information as well. And I just want to thank you, Jay, for making time to be with us. And thank you to our members who took the time as well. So hopefully you found this helpful, and we hope to see you on the next webinar. Bye now.